The year is 1971. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, then a law professor and co-founder of the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, was facing a legal and social landscape where blatant gender discrimination was legally enshrined and culturally accepted. This wasn't about subtle biases. No, this was the actual letter of the law. The system wasn't just biased, the bias was the system. And into this world, Ginsburg brought a radical idea that the best way to tear down a fortress isn't with a battering ram, but by quietly and methodically removing one stone at a time. Today, we're breaking down that systematic, world-changing philosophy, the RBG Rule.
To really get your head around the mountain she had to climb, you have to picture the legal reality back then. A woman could be legally fired just for getting pregnant. A husband could literally move the family home without his wife's okay. And women? They were often kept off juries because they were seen as too sensitive or, just not smart enough for the job. These weren't loopholes. This was the architecture of the law itself, built on centuries of so-called common sense.
And this really captures the sheer scale of the challenge. The whole legal and cultural framework just seemed impenetrable. Now, the common activist strategy at the time was all about loud, passionate public confrontation. And while that's great for raising awareness, in a courtroom, it often backfired. It let the all-male legal establishment dismiss calls for change as, emotional or radical. Ginsburg saw this. She knew that to beat a system that prides itself on cold, hard logic, you can't just yell at it. You have to beat it at its own game. You have to be smarter, more prepared, and way more patient. She needed a whole new playbook.
So, here's how we're going to break down her revolutionary method. First, we'll dive into that world of inequality. Then, we'll see how her own experiences with exclusion actually created her unique approach. We'll define the 3 pillars of the RBG Rule itself, then look at the system she used to put it into action. After that, we'll reflect on her incredible legacy, and finally, pull out the core lesson for all of us on the power of rigor.
Okay, let's get into it. To understand the incredible tools she built, we have to first understand the world she was trying to fix, and the key insight that would guide her entire career.
Her big aha moment led to this core idea: systemic inversion. She realized a full frontal assault on the fortress of discrimination was just doomed to fail. The walls were too high, so she flipped the strategy on its head. Instead of attacking from the outside, she would become a saboteur from within. She decided the only way to make real, lasting change was to dismantle these laws one by one, using cases that were so logically airtight, so focused, that a court of reason just couldn't say no. This was the beginning of her entire philosophy.
Now, this brilliant strategy wasn't just some abstract idea she came up with. It was a method born from her own very real, very personal struggles with the exact system she was trying to change.
I mean, just look at this timeline. The paradox is almost absurd. Here you have someone who is, by any objective measure, a legal genius. Top of her class at Cornell, then again at Columbia, Harvard Law Review. She had a resume that should have opened any door, but door after door was slammed in her face. Law firms flat out refused to hire her. A Supreme Court justice rejected her for a clerkship, and the reason was always the same: she was a woman. This wasn't just unfair, it was illogical, and this constant systemic exclusion ended up being her greatest teacher.
This experience forced her to forge a new weapon. If the system was going to be biased against her, then she would make her arguments so flawless, so free of passion, so grounded in pure logic that her identity would become irrelevant. You see, bias can't touch an argument that's built like a mathematical proof. She understood this fundamental truth. To get radical results, she had to stand on her principles privately, but argue purely on logic publicly. She would systematically prove how absurd gender discrimination was, not by appealing for fairness, but by exposing its logical flaws, one quiet, irrefutable win at a time.
And that brings us right to the heart of this explainer, the core philosophy she engineered. Let's break down the pillars of the world-changing strategy we call the RBG Rule.
At the very center of her rule was this deep belief: the law isn't a set of commands to be blindly followed, and it's not some evil structure to be torn down in one go. Instead, she saw the law as a complex tool, an instrument that could be used for its own gradual perfection. Now that requires a ton of patience and faith in a system, even when it's failing. It meant treating social change not as some big, dramatic event, but as a slow, steady, and carefully documented process of evolution.
Her entire approach can really be broken down into 3 core principles. These are the pillars holding up the RBG Rule. First, take small steps. Second, use a brilliant tactic I'm calling strategic empathy. And third, always maintain a cool, unflappable command. So let's dig into each one of these.
The first pillar is the small steps mandate. Think of this as radical incrementalism. Instead of going to the Supreme Court and asking them to strike down all gender discrimination at once, which would have been rejected and caused a huge backlash, she picked her battles with surgical precision. She brought a series of small, very specific test cases. Each victory was just a little chip in a giant wall. But together, these small wins slowly and systematically eroded the legal foundation of discrimination. It made the change feel like a reasonable evolution, not a revolution. And that made it stick. It became irreversible.
Okay, this is where her strategic genius just blows my mind. The second pillar, the strategic empathy protocol. She knew an all-male court might just tune out when women complained about inequality. They might see it as just another special interest group. So what did she do? She brilliantly chose male plaintiffs, men who were actually being harmed by these same gender-based laws. Take the case of Charles Moritz, a guy who couldn't get a tax deduction for taking care of his mom because the law only gave it to women. By putting a man in front of the court, she forced those all-male judges to see that gender bias wasn't a women's issue. It was a systemic flaw that hurt everyone. It was an absolute masterstroke.
And the final pillar was her own personal operating system, the Cool Command Doctrine. In a world that was just waiting to label an assertive woman as emotional or hysterical, Ginsburg adopted this discipline of almost Zen-like calm. Her demeanor was always cool, intellectual, and intensely focused. This wasn't just her personality, it was a strategy. It guaranteed that her arguments were seen as pure, undeniable reasoning, with no emotion to get in the way. It was like an intellectual armor that disarmed her opponents and forced them to deal with her logic because there was nothing else for them to attack.
So, we have the philosophy, but a philosophy is just an idea if you don't have a system to execute it. So let's look at how she actually put all this into practice, the routines she used to turn her rule into consistent, repeatable wins. Her approach was the complete opposite of the loud resistance of the era. Loud resistance, it's often aiming for that one big, dramatic victory. It's fueled by anger, it's emotional, and because of that, it's high risk. It often creates an equally powerful backlash. RBG's quiet persistence, that was the long game. It was all about a series of small, flawless victories, each one building on the last. It was based entirely on logic, which made it low risk and allowed it to steadily build precedent. Brick by brick, she built a new foundation, until, one day, the old building just couldn't stand anymore.
To pull this off, she relied on two primary systems, two core habits that really defined her work. First was how she prepared her arguments, and second was how she strategically used defeat to her advantage. Her first routine was the meticulous brief construction and logic check. And I mean, this was an almost obsessive process. Every single legal brief was stripped down to its absolute bare essentials, like a mechanic taking apart an engine. She was targeting what she called statutory illogic, finding the exact point where a law contradicted itself or just led to a ridiculous outcome. Her goal was to lead the judges down a path of pure reason, step by step, until her conclusion was the only one they could possibly reach. It became inescapable.
Her second core habit was just as powerful, especially later on the Supreme Court, the continuous public scrutiny and dissent protocol. When she was on the losing side of a case, she never saw it as the end. She would systematically use her dissents as legal arguments aimed at the future. Her dissenting opinions weren't just angry disagreements, they were roadmaps. They laid out the logical reason why the majority was wrong, preserving that logic in the official record for a future generation of lawyers and judges. She was planting seeds of reason, knowing that someday the law would catch up to her logic.
So what was the end result of this lifetime of systematic, patient work? Let's turn to her incredible legacy and her unlikely transformation from a legal outsider into a global cultural icon.
I mean, her journey is one of the great American stories. From that brilliant but excluded law school grad who couldn't get a job, she became a pioneering ACLU lawyer, the chief architect of the legal fight for women's rights. That work propelled her to the federal courts and eventually the U.S. Supreme Court. And in her later years, her fierce intellect turned her into this unlikely cultural icon. The remarkable thing is, this entire transformation was built on the exact same principles she developed as a young lawyer facing a hostile world. Her method never changed.
Ultimately, her legacy is etched into the very fabric of the Constitution itself. She is single-handedly responsible for transforming the legal standard for gender equality in the United States. She took the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and, case by patient case, taught the courts how to apply it to women. She proved beyond any doubt that systematic incrementalism, strategic empathy, and pure legal rigor are the superior tools for creating lasting, structural change.
And that brings us to our final section, and maybe the most important question of all. What can we take away from her life's work? What is the universal lesson in her incredible story? So, after exploring her strategy, her struggles, and her monumental wins, what's the real lesson here? What does her life teach us about how to make real, enduring change in the world?
It's this profound truth, one that Ruth Bader Ginsburg built her entire legacy on. True, lasting, structural change is one with logic, not emotion. Passion can start a movement, sure. Anger can fuel it, but it's persistence and logic that see it through to the end. She showed the world that the most powerful way to challenge an unjust system is not to rage against it, but to master its own rules of reason and use them against it with disciplined, relentless precision.
And so, the RBG Rule really gives us a blueprint for making change, in any field. First, reject those high-risk, all-or-nothing gambles. Instead, go for a series of small, meticulous, flawless victories that build momentum. It shows us the power of stripping our arguments down to their pure, logical core until they're just impossible to refute. And finally, it teaches us to find that surgical point of attack, the precise place where the old system is most vulnerable to the clear light of logic. In the end, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life reminds us that structural change is won with logic, not emotion. The RBG Rule provides a systematic blueprint for how quiet persistence beats loud resistance through surgical strategy and legal rigor. And it leaves us with this one single powerful line that connects her relentless pursuit of justice to an immutable rule. Quiet, persistent rigor is the ultimate source of unassailable power.